"You're going to give us sons," said the 3 obese virgins to the Amish man. What happened next left the whole town gasping. Out on the snowy Colorado plains, 3 lonely sisters find a stranger half frozen by the river. They bring him inside just to save his life. But when one of them says those fateful words, the rumor spreads faster than wildfire. By sundown, the town preachers knocking on their door, the church bells tolling, and whispers of sin echo through every window. But this quiet Amish man hides a secret of his own, a past that cost him everything, and a promise he can't break. As snow falls and faith is tested, hearts will be rebuilt from ashes, and the women everyone mocked will dare to show the meaning of real grace. Now the whole valley's watching. What did those sisters truly mean when they said he'd give them sons? And when truth finally comes to light, will mercy be enough to save them all? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The bitter wind howled across the prairie as Charlotte Pike squinted through the swirling snow. Her sisters June and Liddy huddled close beside her on the wagon seat, their breaths coming out in white puffs. The creek wasn't far, but in this weather, even familiar paths turned treacherous. "We should have fetched water earlier," June fretted, pulling her woolen shawl tighter. "Can't change that now," Charlotte answered, her voice steady despite the cold gnawing at her bones. "House barrel's nearly empty, and the livestock need water come morning." Liddy, quiet as always, pointed through the curtain of white. There, slumped against a snow-covered boulder near the creek's edge, lay a dark shape. "Lord have mercy," Charlotte breathed, pulling the wagon to a stop. The shape resolved into a man, his clothes crusted with ice, one hand clutching something to his chest. June gasped. "Is he—" "Still breathing," Charlotte said, already climbing down. The snow crunched under her boots as she approached. Up close, she could see his face was pale as milk, his dark beard flecked with frost. In his rigid fingers, he gripped a simple wooden cross. "Help me get him up," Charlotte called to her sisters. Together they managed to haul him onto the wagon bed. June tucked their spare blanket around him while Liddy whispered prayers. The journey back seemed endless, with sleet stinging their faces and the wagon wheels fighting through deepening snow. When they finally reached their ranch house, its windows glowing with lamplight, Charlotte's arms ached from holding the reins so tight. Inside, they stoked the iron stove until it glowed cherry red. The man's coat was soaked through, plain black wool with hooks instead of buttons. As they removed it, June's eyes widened. "He's Amish," she said softly, recognizing the traditional cut of his clothes. "Far from home, by the looks of him." Charlotte felt his forehead. "Fever's starting. Liddy, fetch more blankets. June, get that kettle on." Hours passed in anxious waiting. They took turns watching him, speaking in whispers as if afraid to disturb God's work. Near midnight, his eyes finally opened, deep brown and confused. "Where?" His voice was rough as sandpaper. "You're at the Pike Sisters Ranch," Charlotte told him, "near Red Dog Crossing. We found you by the creek, half frozen. I'm Charlotte Pike, and these are my sisters June and Liddy." He tried to sit up, but weakness pushed him back. "Asher Stoltzfus," he managed, "from Pennsylvania." "Pennsylvania?" June brought him a cup of hot broth. "That's a fair piece from here." Asher sipped slowly, his hands trembling. "I was seeking something, got caught in the storm." His eyes found the wooden cross they'd set on the table. "Thank you for saving my life." "God's hand guided us," Charlotte said firmly. "Though what brought an Amish man so far west, alone in winter, that's between you and the Lord." Supper was simple: beans, cornbread, and more broth. They ate in silence, broken only by the crack of logs in the stove and the persistent howl of wind. Charlotte caught June stealing glances at their strange guest, while Liddy watched him with the same careful attention she gave to sick lambs. When Asher spoke again, his voice was stronger. "Once I can walk proper, I'll move on. Don't want to be a burden." "You're God's work now," Charlotte declared, in the same tone she used when the banker came making threats about their mortgage. "Until he shows us why he sent you our way, you'll stay right here where we can keep an eye on you." Outside, wolves began their nightly chorus, their voices rising wild and lonely over the snow-buried prairie. Charlotte saw Asher shiver, though the room was warm. Later, after they'd settled him in their father's old room, the sisters knelt together by the stove. The flames painted their faces gold as they joined hands in prayer. "Lord," Charlotte began, her calloused fingers tight around her sister's softer ones, "we ask for wisdom. This stranger you've placed in our care, show us your purpose. Guide our hearts and hands in whatever work you've set before us." "Amen," June whispered, and Liddy echoed it with a squeeze of their hands. Rising from prayer, Charlotte caught sight of their reflections in the window glass, 3 women alone on the frontier, now responsible for a mysterious man who carried nothing but faith and a wooden cross. The wolves sang on, but inside their sturdy house, the fire crackled warm and sure, like God's own answer to their questions. Dawn brought a pale light through the frost-etched windows. Asher sat bundled in patchwork quilts near the crackling hearth, his trembling fingers working carefully at the wire frames of his broken spectacles. The fall into the snow had bent them badly, and without them, the world stayed frustratingly blurred. The kitchen bustled with morning activity. Charlotte's strong hands kneaded dough on the flour-dusted table, her movements sure and practiced. The warm scent of baking bread filled the air, mingling with wood smoke and coffee. June moved about the kitchen like a songbird, humming Amazing Grace as she stirred a pot of morning porridge. Liddy hovered near Asher, watching his careful work with the spectacles. She'd twist her apron strings, then smooth them, twist and smooth again. When he glanced up, she'd duck her head and pretend to be busy with something else. "There," Asher said softly, settling the mended frames on his nose. The world sharpened into focus, revealing the full state of the ranch house's disrepair. Loose floorboards creaked underfoot. A draft whistled through gaps in the wallboards. Water stains marked the ceiling where the roof leaked. "If I might ask," he ventured carefully, "why haven't these repairs been seen to?" Charlotte's kneading slowed. She brushed a strand of hair from her face with the back of her wrist, leaving a smudge of flour on her cheek. "We had different plans for this place once, bigger plans." June's humming faded. "We meant to make it a home for orphans," she explained, stirring the porridge more slowly. "So many children lost their folks to cholera last year, or got left behind when wagon trains moved on. But we never had the strength," Charlotte added, her voice matter-of-fact, though her eyes held old pain. "Nor the means. Takes more than 3 women to build proper dormitories and schoolrooms." The day passed in quiet industry. Asher insisted on helping with small tasks, though his hands still trembled from the cold. As they gathered for supper, June set out bowls of thick stew while Liddy sliced fresh bread. "Townfolk aren't kind about our dreams," June said suddenly, breaking a long silence. "They call us names behind our backs. Say we're just fat old maids with empty arms playing at being mothers." Charlotte's spoon clattered against her bowl. "That's why you're here," she burst out, eyes bright with sudden certainty. "You're going to give us sons!" Asher choked on his stew, face flushing deep red. June patted his back while Liddy hurried to fetch water. The silence stretched thin as new ice. That is, Asher stammered, still coughing. Charlotte's own face reddened as she realized how her words had sounded. "The orphanage," she clarified quickly. "Your carpentry skills could help us build it proper. Give those children the home they need." Relief flooded Asher's face, though his cheeks stayed pink. June giggled behind her hand, and even Liddy cracked a small smile. Unknown to them, Tom Wilson, a ranch hand from the Bradley spread, had ridden up to their door with a message about strayed cattle. Hearing voices through the thin walls, he'd paused to listen. Now he wheeled his horse around, grinning wide as he spurred toward town. Wait till the boys at the saloon heard about the Pike sisters, proposing to that strange Amish fellow. Later that night, after the sisters had retired to their rooms, Asher knelt beside his borrowed bed. The moonlight spilled through the window, turning the rough floorboards silver. His prayers came hesitant and uncertain. "Lord," he whispered, "you led me here in the storm. But is this where you want me to stay? These good women need help, true enough. But after what happened in Pennsylvania..." His voice trailed off as memories of his banishment pressed heavy on his heart. Outside, a coyote called lonely across the snow-covered prairie, and Asher bowed his head, waiting for guidance about whether to leave or stay another day. The wooden cross he'd carried lay on the bedside table, its shadow stretching long in the moonlight. Like the Pike sisters' dream of an orphanage, it stood as a testament to faith waiting to be fulfilled. 2 days passed like a gentle stream, filled with small repairs and shared meals. On the third morning, Asher adjusted the borrowed coat around his shoulders and mounted Charlotte's old mule for the ride into Red Dog Crossing. They needed nails for repairs and flour for June's baking. The winter sun hung pale in the sky as he made his way down the rutted trail. The town's main street stretched before him, muddy snow piled in dirty heaps along the boardwalks. As he tied the mule to the hitching post, he noticed the stairs. Women whispered behind gloved hands. Men lounging outside the saloon smirked and nudged each other. Inside Henderson's general store, the bell above the door announced his entrance. The familiar scents of leather, coffee beans, and tobacco filled the air. Asher had just finished selecting his items when a booming voice startled him. "Well now, if it isn't our Amish friend." Reverend Amos Culver's smile was wide as a canyon, but his eyes remained cold as river rocks. He clapped Asher's shoulder with a heavy hand. "How are those 3 ladies keeping you?" The question carried an edge that made Asher's neck prickle. "They are kind Christian women," he answered carefully, "allowing me to repay their mercy with work." Mercy, indeed. Culver's smile never wavered. 3 unmarried sisters taking in a strange man, that's quite merciful. He leaned closer, dropping his voice, though some might call it something else entirely. Asher stepped back, his chest tight. "I should return. There's work waiting." "I'm sure there is," Culver called after him as he paid for his goods. "I'm sure there is." The ride home felt longer, the mule's hooves crunching through crusty snow. Something had shifted in town, like storm clouds gathering on a clear day. When they passed the Wheeler farm, old Mrs. Wheeler, who always waved from her porch, turned her back and went inside. That afternoon, Charlotte noticed their nearest neighbor, Tom Bradley, ride past without his usual friendly wave. The sisters exchanged worried glances over the supper table. June tried to lighten the mood. "Well, if they're all too busy being proper to wave, that's more time for us to get work done?" But her smile didn't reach her eyes. Liddy sat silent, pushing food around her plate. Her shoulders were tight with worry, and she kept glancing at the window as if expecting trouble to appear. After supper, Asher worked on a broken window frame, while the sisters gathered around the piano. Their voices rose sweet and clear in the gathering dusk, singing "Blessed Assurance." The familiar hymn filled the ranch house with warmth as fresh snow began falling outside, dancing past the windows in the lamplight. "Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. Oh, what a foretaste of glory divine." Later that night, when the sisters had retired, except for Charlotte, Asher sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. The lamp cast shadows on the walls as he finally spoke of what he'd carried silently these past days. "Back in Pennsylvania," he began softly, "there was a flood. The creek rose so fast the waters were like God's own judgment." He paused, gathering words like fallen leaves. "I heard screaming from the bank. A native woman and her little one. Their horse had slipped in the mud." Charlotte sat very still, listening. "Our elders had strict rules about mixing with outsiders, but I couldn't—" His voice caught. "I couldn't just watch them die. I got them out, took them to our barn until the waters receded." The lamplight flickered across his face. "The elders said I'd brought shame to our community, that I'd chosen worldly interference over our ways." Tears shone in Charlotte's eyes, catching the lamplight like stars. "They gave me 1 day to leave," Asher continued. "My wife, Sarah, she followed me into exile, said she wouldn't let me bear it alone." His fingers tightened around the cup. "She took sick that first winter. I couldn't—" He swallowed hard. "I couldn't save her like I saved them." Charlotte reached across the table, her strong hand covering his. "You did what was right," she whispered fiercely. "God's law of love comes before man's law of separation." Asher looked up, meeting her gaze. "Mercy has a cost," he said softly. They sat in silence then, heads bowed as the wind moaned through the rafters like a lonely prayer. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the earth in a blank white page, waiting for what tomorrow might write upon it. Dawn crept over the Pike Ranch with fingers of pale gold, revealing fresh snow and something more troubling. Boot prints circling the barn, stark against the white powder. Charlotte spotted them first while heading out to milk the cows. Her breath caught as she traced their path with her eyes. Multiple sets, some stopping to peer through cracks in the barn walls. "Like wolves testing the fence," she muttered, hurrying back to tell the others. By mid-morning, the winter sun had climbed higher but brought little warmth. June was at the kitchen window, kneading bread dough when she heard it first, the rattle of wagon wheels on the frozen road. Her hands stilled in the flour. "They're coming," she called out, her voice trembling. "4 men in Mr. Henderson's wagon. The Reverend's with them." Charlotte straightened her apron and squared her shoulders. Liddy appeared at her side, face pale but chin lifted like their father had taught them. Asher emerged from the barn, wiping wood shavings from his hands. The wagon pulled up in a cloud of snow powder. Reverend Culver sat tall in the driver's seat, his black coat gleaming with self-importance. Behind him, 3 of the town's most prominent men, Henderson from the store, Bradley their neighbor, and young Henry Braddock, the Reverend's assistant. "Sisters Pike," Culver's voice boomed across the yard. "We've come about this situation." He fixed his gaze on Asher. "You're harboring a fallen man, a man cast out by his own people for breaking God's natural order." June clutched her Bible to her chest, its worn leather familiar under her fingers. Liddy shifted behind Charlotte, who stood like an oak in winter, unbending, unafraid. "There's nothing fallen here," Charlotte declared, "except the snow and your good sense, Reverend." Asher stepped forward, removing his hat. His voice came quiet but clear as a church bell. "I've done no wrong, neither then nor now. I came only to build something holy." "Holy?" Culver scoffed. 3 unmarried women taking in a strange man. The whole town's talking. Either you leave now, or we'll have the sheriff arrest you for vagrancy and moral corruption." A heavy silence fell, broken only by the creak of leather as the men shifted in their seats. The winter wind whispered through bare branches, waiting. Then Asher spoke again, his words carrying across the yard like a hymn. "If righteousness is measured by cruelty, then you can have it." He settled his hat back on his head. "But God's work will be done here, with or without your blessing." Bradley looked down, unable to meet Charlotte's eyes. Henderson coughed uncomfortably. Young Henry Braddock's face flushed red with shame. "You'll regret this defiance," Culver said, but his voice had lost its thunder. He flicked the reins, turning the wagon around. The other men avoided looking back as they rattled away, leaving wheel ruts in the fresh snow. That evening, the sisters and Asher gathered by the fire. June's hand still shook as she poured the tea. Liddy sat close to Charlotte, seeking comfort in her sister's solid presence. "We won't let them drive you away," Charlotte said firmly, though her voice held a trace of worry. "Not when the Lord himself led you to our door." Asher studied the flames, his spectacles reflecting the dancing light. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "this is why I was meant to come here, not just to receive shelter, but to help build it for others." Charlotte sat up straighter, her eyes brightening. "The old barn," she said. "We could rebuild it proper, make it into the orphan house we always dreamed of. Show them all what good works really look like." "A home for children?" June whispered, hope threading through her words. "Built with love instead of judgment." "I'll stay through the winter," Asher said. "Help you build something that will last." He smiled gently. "Something holy indeed." Outside, snow began falling again, thick and steady as blessing. Inside, the fire crackled with warmth, and 4 hearts beat with renewed purpose. The tea grew cold in their cups as they talked late into the night, sketching dreams in the firelight, planning spaces for small beds and big hearts. Liddy finally spoke, her quiet voice full of certainty. "God sent us a carpenter, just like he did before." They all smiled at that, feeling the truth of it settle in their souls like the snow settling on the earth outside, covering all the boot prints and wagon tracks with something pure and new. The days stretched into a gentle rhythm as January eased toward February. Each morning, frost painted the window panes with delicate patterns while inside, the Pike sisters' kitchen filled with the warmth of coffee and fresh bread. Outside, the steady thunk of Asher's axe marked time like a heartbeat. He'd found a stand of fallen pines on the north ridge, toppled by winter storms. "God provides," he'd said simply, examining the straight, strong trunks. Now he worked from sunup to sundown, turning those trees into the bones of their dream. His hands, rough with calluses, shaped each beam with careful precision. Charlotte organized their days with quiet efficiency. She and her sisters formed a chain between house and barn, passing boards and tools like offerings. June's cooking filled their bellies with hearty beef stews and dumplings, keeping their strength up for the work. Even Liddy, usually so reserved, found her place in their shared purpose. She swept sawdust with gentle dedication, humming hymns under her breath. "You know," June said one afternoon, watching Asher measure a beam 3 times before cutting, "if you furrow your brow any harder, Mr. Stoltzfus, you'll need to plow it come spring." Her teasing brought a rare smile to Asher's serious face. "Better careful than crooked," he replied, but his eyes crinkled at the corners. The evenings brought them together around the kitchen table, where Asher's voice filled the room with scripture readings. His gentle Pennsylvania accent gave the familiar words new meaning, and something more than the barn began taking shape, a family formed in faith and purpose. "Unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it," he read one night, lamplight catching his spectacles. Charlotte noticed how June leaned forward to catch every word, how Liddy's hands stilled in her mending. The barn's transformation happened slowly but surely. New beams replaced rotted ones, fresh planks covered gaps where winter wind once howled. Charlotte spent one afternoon carving a sign in secret. "The House of Sons," it read, each letter carved with careful love. She wrapped it in burlap and tucked it away, waiting for the right moment. When Sunday came, Charlotte suggested they invite neighbors for soup after services. "Breaking bread might break down walls," she said hopefully. June cooked enough for 20, but only 3 families came. The Hendersons from the store, Widow McCready and her daughter, and old Jim Tucker, who lived alone up the creek. Still, they gathered around the table, steam rising from bowls of vegetable soup thick with dumplings. Charlotte bowed her head and spoke the blessing with quiet joy. "Thank you, Lord, for the miracle already begun in this place." After their guests left, darkness settled early as February days do. They were checking the animals one last time when a sound caught their attention, a rustle from high in the hayloft, followed by a scraping noise. "Raccoon, most likely," June whispered, clutching Charlotte's arm. "They've been after the chicken feed." Asher lifted his lantern higher, its light throwing shadows against the newly repaired walls. They stood still, listening. The rustle came again, and then a sound that froze them all in place. A child's cough, quickly muffled but unmistakable. The lantern trembled slightly in Asher's steady hand. Charlotte's heart pounded as she met his eyes. That cough spoke of more than just a nighttime visitor. It carried fear, cold, and hunger in its echo. They remained motionless, barely breathing. The quiet stretched thin as spider silk, waiting to see what God had brought to their unfinished door. In that moment, standing in the barn they'd worked so hard to rebuild, Charlotte felt the full weight of their purpose settling around them like a mantle. Their house of sons, it seemed, had already found its first child. The lantern flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on the fresh-cut beams above. Outside, the winter wind whispered through pine branches, and somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called, long and lonely. But here in the barn, in this space built with faith and determination, that muffled cough spoke of new beginnings. Asher's hand tightened on the lantern, and Charlotte saw in his face the same certainty she felt in her heart. Whatever came next, this was the moment their real work would begin. Asher grasped the ladder rungs, his weathered hands steady despite the tension thrumming through his body. The old wood creaked beneath his weight as he climbed toward the hayloft. Charlotte held the lantern below, its light catching dust motes that danced like earthbound stars. At the top, he paused, letting his eyes adjust to the shadows. There, huddled against the back wall, sat a small figure, a boy no more than 8 years old. His bare feet were dirty and scratched, his clothes torn. In his arms, he clutched a crude rag doll made from scraps of cloth. "Hello there," Asher said softly, keeping his distance. "You're safe here." The boy's dark eyes were wide with fear, darting between Asher and the ladder like a trapped animal. Around his neck hung a strand of wooden beads decorated with intricate patterns, Ute craftwork. Asher's heart skipped a beat. They were identical to those worn by the mother he'd pulled from the floodwaters years ago, the act that had cost him his place among the Amish. "Charlotte," Asher called down quietly, "would you bring up some bread and milk?" June's voice floated up. "I'll heat it first." While they waited, Asher sat cross-legged on the hay, giving the boy space. "I'm Asher," he said. "Would you tell me your name?" The child remained silent, but his grip on the doll loosened slightly. When Charlotte appeared with a bowl of warm milk and fresh bread, she set it halfway between them and backed away. The boy watched them both, then looked at the food with naked hunger. "It's for you," Asher encouraged. Slowly, the child crept forward. As he reached for the bread, Asher noticed angry red marks on his wrists. Rope burns. His throat tightened with anger and grief. "Samuel," the boy whispered suddenly, his voice rough from disuse. He tore into the bread like he hadn't eaten in days. June appeared at the top of the ladder with an armload of quilts. "Poor lambs half frozen," she murmured, laying them nearby. Samuel flinched at her movement but didn't retreat. That night, they made him a bed near the kitchen stove. For 2 days, he barely spoke, but his eyes followed their movements constantly. Asher noticed how he relaxed slightly when Liddy was near, perhaps because she moved with the same quiet watchfulness he did. On the evening of the second day, Samuel finally broke his silence. "Soldiers came," he whispered, as Asher sat whittling beside him. "Fire everywhere. Mama told me run." His words fell like stones into still water. In the kitchen, June stifled a sob. Charlotte's hand stilled in her bread dough, tears rolling silently down her cheeks. Liddy slipped from her chair to sit closer to Samuel, offering wordless comfort. Asher worked late into the night at his workbench, carefully shaping a small wooden horse. His knife strokes were gentle, each cut a kind of prayer. When he finished, he placed it beside Samuel's sleeping form and whispered a blessing in Pennsylvania Dutch. The next morning, Henry Braddock, Reverend Culver's assistant, rode past the ranch. He reined his horse to a stop when he spotted Asher showing Samuel how to feed the chickens. The young man's eyes narrowed, and he spurred his mount toward town. By afternoon, whispers were racing through Red Dog Crossing. "The Pike women harbor a savage," they said. "That Amish fellow's gone native." But inside the ranch house, a different story was unfolding. June taught Samuel to knead bread dough, flour dusting his serious face. Liddy showed him how to curry the horses, her quiet patience matching his. Charlotte kept him close while she worked, telling him stories from her worn Bible. That evening, they gathered in the kitchen as always. June's clear voice lifted in amazing grace, Charlotte's deeper alto joining in. Liddy hummed softly, and Asher's baritone anchored them all. Samuel sat wrapped in his quilt, watching. Then, hesitantly, he picked up a wooden spoon and began tapping it against his knee in time with the music. The simple rhythm wove through their voices like a new thread in an old tapestry. Charlotte caught Asher's eye across the room, and they shared a look of understanding. This was more than charity now. This was family being born, as surely as spring follows winter. Samuel's wooden horse stood proud on the mantel, its roughly carved mane catching the lamplight. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside, the kitchen glowed with warmth and song. Their house of sons had found its first child, and with him, their purpose had become flesh and blood and beating heart. The week passed like a dream until Friday morning, when hoofbeats broke the quiet. Reverend Culver's polished buggy rolled up to the ranch house, his smile as smooth as creek ice. Charlotte watched from the kitchen window as he adjusted his collar and strode to their door. "Sisters Pike," he called out, removing his hat. "I've come to offer pastoral comfort in these trying times." Charlotte opened the door, keeping her broad frame planted firmly in the entrance. "Much obliged, Reverend, but we're managing fine with the Lord's help." Now, he pressed, peering past her shoulder. "The congregation worries for your souls, harboring a strange man all winter." Before Charlotte could answer, Samuel darted across the kitchen behind her, carrying kindling for the stove. Culver's eyes narrowed. What's this? He straightened, all pretense of kindness falling away. A native child? Here? Samuel, Charlotte said firmly, drawing herself up to her full height. His name is Samuel, and he's under God's protection in this house. Culver's face darkened. You have no right. There are laws. There's a higher law, Charlotte cut in, one that commands us to care for orphans and strangers. This is dangerous foolishness. Culver jammed his hat back on. The Indian agent will hear of this by sundown. After his buggy disappeared, Asher gathered them in the kitchen. His face was grave as he warmed his hands by the stove. The agent will come, he said quietly. They'll try to take him back to the reservation. June clutched her Bible. But they burned his camp. His mother. I know. Asher's voice was gentle. We should petition the agency, explain our intention to give him a Christian home. The passes are deep with snow, Liddy whispered. No mail rider for weeks. They fell silent, watching Samuel arrange his wooden animals on the hearth. Charlotte's jaw set with determination. Then we pray and prepare. God didn't send him here to be lost. That night, Samuel's scream pierced the darkness. They found him thrashing in his quilts, tears streaming down his face. Asher gathered the trembling boy in his arms, his deep voice steady as he began. Our Father, who art in heaven. Samuel's breathing slowed as the familiar words washed over him. June and Liddy joined in, their voices twining together in the dark kitchen. Charlotte lit a lamp, its glow creating a circle of warmth around their impromptu prayer meeting. When morning came, Asher took Samuel to his workbench. He showed the boy how to hold sandpaper, guiding his small hands across a rough plank. Smooth and steady, Asher murmured. Like this. That's right, our first son. Samuel's face brightened at the word son. He worked with intense concentration, his tongue caught between his teeth. The sisters watched from the doorway, sharing quiet smiles. The peace shattered at noon. 6 riders approached through the swirling snow, blue uniforms stark against the white. Charlotte's heart sank as she recognized the Indian agent's insignia. They dismounted in the yard, boots crunching on frozen ground. The lead soldier handed Charlotte a paper, his expression uncomfortable but firm. By order of the agency, he began, the Ute boy must be surrendered to proper authorities. Please, June stepped forward, her voice breaking. He's just a child. He needs a home. The law is clear, ma'am. The soldier shifted his weight. These people belong on the reservation. 1 week, Charlotte bargained, drawing herself up. Give us 1 week to make proper arrangements. It's the Christian thing. The soldier studied their faces. Charlotte's stern resolve, June's tears, Liddy's quiet fear. He glanced at Asher standing protectively near Samuel in the doorway. Until Sunday, he conceded finally. We'll return after services. Have him ready. They watched the soldiers ride away, their forms growing indistinct in the thickening snow. Inside, Samuel huddled close to Asher, his small fingers working the beads around his neck. The rest of the day passed in heavy silence. Charlotte kneaded bread with fierce energy, her prayers rising like steam. June sang hymns in a wavering voice while she mended. Liddy sat with Samuel, teaching him to tie knots in leather strips, their heads bent together in shared concentration. As night fell, snow whispered against the windows. The wind moaned through the rafters of their half-finished barn, their house of suns that now seemed more dream than destiny. But in the kitchen's warmth, they gathered close, a family bound by something stronger than law or blood, the fierce, tender mercy that had brought them together. They had 6 days to find a way, 6 days to prove that love could overcome fear, that grace could bend the iron bars of law. 6 days to save their first son. Sunday morning crept over the horizon like a ghost, pale and cold. Dawn painted the snow-covered ranch in shades of gray, matching the heavy hearts within. The sisters moved through their morning routine in silence, donning their best black dresses as if preparing for a funeral. Charlotte stood before her mirror, pinning up her hair with trembling fingers. Each breath felt like glass in her chest. Down the hall, she could hear June softly singing, "Amazing Grace," her voice catching on every other word. In the kitchen, Liddy helped Samuel button his coat, the warmest they had, though still too thin for winter. The boy's dark eyes were wide and solemn, understanding more than they wished he did. He hadn't spoken since yesterday. Asher sat at the table, turning his coffee cup round and round, leaving rings on the worn wood. His shoulders bore the weight of what was coming, but his face remained carefully blank. The morning light caught his spectacles, hiding his eyes. "Time for prayer," Charlotte announced, her voice stronger than she felt. They gathered in their usual circle, hands linked. Samuel pressed against Charlotte's skirts, small fingers clutching the fabric like a lifeline. The hours dragged until noon. When hoofbeats finally echoed across the frozen yard, Charlotte felt Samuel start trembling. June began to weep quietly. The soldiers arrived in a cluster of blue uniforms and stamping horses. Their breath clouded in the bitter air as they dismounted. The same officer from before stepped forward, hat in hand. "Ma'am," he nodded to Charlotte. "We've come for the boy." Asher moved first, kneeling before Samuel. His big carpenter's hands were gentle as they rested on the child's shoulders. "Trust in the Lord," he said softly. "He sees all things." Charlotte stepped forward, one arm around Samuel. "Please," she began, though she knew it was futile. "He's just a child. We can give him a good Christian home." "The law is clear," the officer interrupted, not unkindly. "He belongs with his people." "We are his people now," Charlotte's voice cracked. But the soldiers were already moving forward. Asher reached into his pocket and pressed the small wooden horse he'd carved into Samuel's hand. The boy clutched it tight, his other hand still gripping Charlotte's skirts until they gently pulled him away. They watched helplessly as Samuel was lifted onto a horse. He didn't cry or struggle, just stared back at them with eyes that had seen too much loss already. The soldiers rode away, taking with them the dream of what might have been. The house felt like a tomb afterward. June tried to make supper, but no one could eat. Liddy disappeared into her room. The silence grew thick as winter ice until Charlotte finally broke. "You just let them take him," she said, rounding on Asher. Her voice trembled with grief and rage. "All your prayers and scripture, but when it mattered, you did nothing." Asher looked up from his hands. Violence would have only brought more violence. "Faith without fight is hollow," Charlotte spat. "What good is mercy if it won't stand against cruelty?" The words struck like physical blows. Asher stood slowly, his face lined with hurt. Without a word, he walked out. Into the gathering dark. The barn door creaked as he entered. He grabbed his hammer and began working, aimlessly, desperately, driving nails into boards that needed no nailing. The rhythmic pounding echoed his heartbeat, drowning out thought and feeling until his arms ached. Hours passed. The temperature dropped further, his breath visible in the lantern light. Finally, footsteps crunched in the snow outside. June appeared in the doorway, carrying a steaming cup. "Coffee," she said simply, setting it nearby. "You'll freeze out here?" Asher paused in his work, but didn't look up. "I failed you all." "Charlotte's hurting," June said softly. We all are, but pointing fingers won't bring Samuel back. She touched his arm gently. There's grace enough for everyone's pain. In town that same evening, Reverend Culver held court at the general store. Order has been restored, he proclaimed to his nodding audience. Christian charity is one thing, but those women had no business harboring a savage. The words would have cut deep if Asher could have heard them, but he was alone behind the barn, staring up at the vast field of stars. His breath fogged in the frigid air as he whispered, "Lord, if I erred by peace, show me." The words hung in the darkness like a prayer unanswered. 2 days crept past under slate-gray skies that hung low and heavy over Red Dog Crossing. The ranch house stood silent as a tomb, with only the whisper of wind through the rafters to mark time's passage. Charlotte moved through her days like a ghost, speaking only when necessary, her usual commanding presence dimmed by grief. In the kitchen, June tried to lift spirits by baking Samuel's favorite honey biscuits, but the gesture only deepened the ache of his absence. Liddy kept busy with the animals, spending extra time in the barn where no one could see her tears. Asher worked steadily, his hammer ringing against the barn walls from sunrise to sunset. "It's penance," he said quietly when June brought him coffee. "Every nail, a prayer." His hands were raw from working in the cold, but he wouldn't stop. The weather turned fierce by the second afternoon. Snow fell in thick curtains, driven sideways by howling wind. The trail to town disappeared under deep drifts, leaving them isolated in their grief. That evening, Asher sat at the kitchen table by lamplight, carefully writing a letter to the Indian Agency. "Dear Sirs," he began, his normally steady hand shaking slightly. "I write to inquire after the welfare of the boy Samuel, recently taken from our care." He paused, searching for words that might move stone hearts. Charlotte's nights were haunted by dreams. She would wake in darkness, certain she'd heard Samuel calling for her. The empty house seemed to echo with his absence, the quiet spot by the fire where he'd sat, the wooden horse left behind on the windowsill. In town, protected from the storm, Reverend Culver gathered with his deacons in the warm church office. "Those Pike women have brought scandal to our community," he declared, shuffling through papers. "The law allows for immorality fines. Their land would make fine church property." But word leaked out. Sarah Miller, whose farm bordered the Pike Ranch, overheard the plotting during choir practice. Despite the blizzard, she sent her son to warn Liddy. The boy found Liddy in the barn, his face red with cold. "Ma says to tell you, Reverend Culver's fixing to take your land. Says he's got papers charging you with harboring Indians and living in sin with that Amish fellow." Liddy's hands trembled as she rewarded the boy with a fresh biscuit. Once he'd gone, she struggled through deep snow to the barn where Asher worked. Her words tumbled out in a rush of fear and anger. Asher set down his hammer, face grim. "We'll stand firm," he said after a long moment. "Truth before reputation." That evening, the sisters sat at their quiet supper. June pushed potatoes around her plate while Charlotte stared into distance. Liddy had just finished telling them about Culver's scheme when heavy knocking echoed through the house. They found Sheriff Thomas Grady on their porch, snow dusting his broad shoulders. His weathered face was kind but serious as he stepped inside, removing his hat. "Evening, ladies. Mr. Stoltzfus?" He nodded to each in turn. "Wish I was bringing better news." Charlotte stood straight, though her voice wavered slightly. "Speak plain, Sheriff." "Reverend Culver's called for a church hearing, day after tomorrow, regarding your conduct." He shifted uncomfortably. "Says it's about moral authority, but between us, I reckon it's more about your land." June gasped softly. Liddy moved closer to Charlotte, who lifted her chin with familiar determination. "Then let truth speak in daylight," Charlotte declared, her voice growing stronger. "We've nothing to hide from God or man." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Reckon that's so. Still, thought you should have warning. Culver's gathered quite a crowd of supporters." "Thank you, Sheriff," Asher said quietly. "We appreciate your kindness." After Grady left, they gathered in the parlor. The blizzard raged outside, rattling windows and howling through cracks, a mirror of their own internal storm. Charlotte stood by the hearth, firelight casting shadows across her face. "We'll need to be ready," she said finally. "June, gather every receipt, every letter that shows our honest dealings. Liddy, ride to the Miller farm tomorrow if weather permits. See who else might speak for us. And Asher." She paused, meeting his eyes for the first time in days. "We'll need your witness too, if you're willing." Asher stood slowly. "I am, though my word may not count for much." "Truth counts," Charlotte replied, "even when it costs everything." They worked late into the night, preparing their defense while the storm raged on. The wooden sign that read "House of Sons" lay across Charlotte's lap, its letters sharp and clean in the huo lamplight. She traced them with gentle fingers, remembering Samuel's smile when he'd helped paint them. Outside, the blizzard showed no sign of breaking, and somewhere in the darkness, church bells tolled midnight, counting down the hours until their day of judgment. Morning broke cold and harsh over Red Dog Crossing. The sisters and Asher hitched their wagon before dawn, breath frosting in the gray light. Charlotte wrapped extra blankets around their legs as June held the reins. The horses' hooves crunched through ice-crusted snow as they made their slow way into town. "Lord, give us strength," Liddy whispered, clutching her Bible close. The church bells tolled 9 times as they approached. Already, wagons and horses crowded the street outside the white-painted building. Townsfolk huddled in clusters on the steps, falling silent as the pike wagon drew near. Some turned away. Others stared openly. Inside, oil lamps cast yellow light across worried faces. The wooden pews creaked under the weight of what seemed like half the town. Sheriff Grady stood near the pulpit, his badge gleaming dully. His eyes met Charlotte's with something like apology. Reverend Culver stood at the front, black coat crisp, Bible held like a weapon. His assistant, Henry Braddock, hovered nearby, clutching papers. The sisters took seats in the front row while Asher remained standing, hat in hand. "Brothers and sisters," Culver began, voice ringing with practiced authority, "we gather today to address grave sins in our midst." He turned his sharp gaze on the sisters. "These women, who once held respect in our community, have fallen into fornication." Gasps rippled through the crowd. June's face flushed red. Charlotte sat straighter, chin high. "Furthermore," Culver continued, "they have harbored a savage child, defying both law and decency." "That ain't true," Liddy burst out, but Charlotte squeezed her hand quiet. The Reverend's lips curved in a cold smile. "Mr. Stoltzfus, step forward." Asher moved to face the crowd, his bearing calm despite the hostility around him. The morning light through the windows caught his spectacles, hiding his eyes. "Do you deny living under these women's roof? Working their land? Eating at their table?" "I do not deny it," Asher said clearly. "I sheltered the boy Samuel and helped with honest work, but nothing improper occurred beneath that roof." Culver stepped closer. "Then why, sir, would a man of God choose to live among unmarried women? Unless driven by baser instincts?" A few snickers rose from the back pews. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably, boots scuffing the floorboards. Asher's voice remained steady. "Because God asked me to build love where shame had been." He gestured to the sisters. "These women sought to create a home for orphans. I came to help build it. That is all." Murmurs swept through the church like wind through wheat. Charlotte saw several women nodding, their faces softening. But Culver wasn't finished. He snapped his fingers, and Henry Braddock hurried forward with a leather ledger. "Perhaps you can explain this receipt?" The Reverend held up a yellowed paper. "Showing funds withdrawn from the orphan account, signed by you and Miss Pike." Charlotte stood. "That's not possible. We never—" $500, Culver announced loudly. "Stolen from innocent children." The crowd gasped. Sheriff Grady stepped forward, face troubled. "Mr. Stoltzfus, I'm afraid I'll need to take you into custody pending review of these charges." "No!" June cried out. Liddy began to weep. Asher didn't resist as the sheriff pulled out iron manacles. The cuffs clicked shut around his wrists with terrible finality. His eyes found Charlotte's across the space between them. "Truth will stand," he said softly. Charlotte surged forward. "This is wrong. That receipt is forged. We never touched that money." But her words were lost in the growing chaos. People were standing, shouting, pointing. Culver's voice rose above them all, calling for order and righteousness. The sisters watched helplessly as Sheriff Grady led Asher away. His shoulders were straight, head unbowed, but Charlotte saw how his hands trembled in the irons. The ride home was silent, save for June's quiet sobs. Snow began falling again, thick white flakes that erased their wagon tracks behind them. By the time they reached the ranch, it was as if they'd never traveled to town at all, as if truth itself could be covered and hidden like the frozen ground. Charlotte stood in the yard, watching the snow erase all marks of passage. The wooden sign for the orphan home lay in the wagon, its hopeful words now seeming like mockery. June and Liddy huddled together on the porch, their black dresses stark against the whiteness falling all around. "What do we do now?" Liddy's voice was small against the vast silence. Charlotte turned to her sisters, grief etched in every line of her face. But before she could answer, the snow swallowed everything: wagon tracks, footprints, and all evidence of the morning's injustice, leaving only unmarked white as far as the eye could see. Charlotte's knees ached against the rough barn floorboards as dawn's pale light filtered through cracks in the walls. Her breath formed misty clouds in the frigid air while she pressed her hands together in desperate prayer. "Lord, show us the way," she whispered. "Give us strength to face what comes." The barn door suddenly burst open with a bang. Liddy stumbled in, her cheeks flushed from running, hair wild beneath her woolen scarf. "Charlotte, Will Jensen just rode past. He says there's news." Liddy's words tumbled out between gasping breaths. "The Indian agent reported Samuel missing overnight. He's escaped." Charlotte's heart leaped and plunged all at once. Hope warred with fear as she got to her feet, hay clinging to her skirts. "When? How long has he been gone?" They found his bed empty at dawn roll call. Will says there's tracks heading east, toward us. Liddy clutched her sister's arm. "What if he freezes out there?" Charlotte squeezed Liddy's cold fingers. "The Lord wouldn't lead him this far to lose him now." Across town, in the jail's single cell, Asher sat on the narrow cot, his Bible open on his lap. His voice carried steady and clear as he read from Psalms. "I sought the Lord, and he answered me and delivered me from all my fears." Sheriff Grady paused in his paperwork, listening. After a moment, he stood and approached the cell bars. "Mr. Stoltzfus," he said quietly, "something about this don't sit right with me." The sheriff's weathered face showed troubled lines. "I've known Reverend Culver 15 years, but lately..." He shook his head. I mean to look into those orphan funds myself. Church records should show every penny. Asher closed his Bible gently. Thank you, Sheriff. Truth has its own time. Maybe so. Grady glanced toward the window where heavy snow had begun falling again. But justice shouldn't wait on weather. By evening, the storm had worsened considerably. Wind howled around the corners of the Pike Ranch house, driving snow into deep drifts. Charlotte paced by the window, watching darkness gather early under the heavy clouds. We have to go look for him, she announced suddenly, turning to her sisters. Samuel's out there somewhere trying to find his way home. June wrung her hands. But the storm is exactly why we must go now, Charlotte insisted, before his tracks vanish completely. Liddy was already pulling on her heavy coat. I'll harness the mule. He's steadier in snow than the horses. June grabbed lanterns from their hooks, hands shaking as she filled them with oil. Dear Father, protect us all, she prayed softly. Within minutes, they had the mule hitched to their smallest wagon. 3 lanterns swung from the seatboard, casting golden circles in the swirling snow. Charlotte took the reins while her sisters huddled close on either side, sharing warmth. He's coming home, Charlotte whispered as they set out. The words felt like both prayer and prophecy in the gathering dark. They followed the old creek bed east, knowing Samuel would use it as a guide. Wind-driven snow stung their faces. The mule plodded forward steadily, steam rising from his flanks. June suddenly pointed. There! Footprints! Charlotte held her lantern lower, heart pounding. Small tracks appeared and disappeared in the drifting snow, a child's boots, heading toward the ranch. Still fresh, Liddy said, hope threading through her voice. He can't be far ahead. The sisters searched the white darkness, straining to see through the curtain of falling snow. Their lantern light caught crystal flakes in golden suspension, like stars falling all around them. Somewhere ahead, a boy who had already lost one family was struggling toward the only other home he knew. Samuel! Charlotte called into the wind. Samuel, we're here! Their voices carried away into the storms. They pressed forward, following the fading trail of small footprints that led them deeper into the gathering night. The mule's hooves crunched through ice and snow, marking their own path home, if they could find it through the thickening white dark that surrounded them on all sides. Each sister held tight to their shared purpose as they searched, to bring their first son home, where love and mercy waited, no matter what storms might come after. The lanterns swung, 3 points of light moving through the vast Colorado night, while behind them at the ranch, warmth and hope kept vigil for their return. Night settled thick and heavy over the snow-covered valley. The storm showed no sign of letting up as the 3 sisters huddled in their wagon, straining to see through the swirling white darkness. We'll cover more ground if we split up, Charlotte said, pulling the wagon to a halt. June, take the south ravine. Liddy, follow the creek bed. I'll head toward the pine grove. June clutched her lantern tight. What if one of us finds him? 3 sharp whistles, Charlotte answered, like Pa taught us for roundup. They separated into the night, each sister carrying a golden circle of lantern light through the darkness. The wind howled between the trees, drowning out their calls of Samuel. Charlotte trudged through knee-deep drifts, her heavy skirts collecting snow. Something in her heart pulled her toward the stand of pines ahead. That's when she heard it. A soft whimper carried on the wind. Samuel, she called, lifting her lantern higher. Samuel, is that you? Another cry, weaker this time. Charlotte plowed forward, her legs burning with effort. There, beneath a massive pine, she found a small, dark shape huddled against the trunk. "Oh, thank the Lord," she breathed, dropping to her knees beside him. Samuel's face was pale with cold, his lips blue-tinged. Without hesitation, Charlotte unwrapped her thick wool shawl and bundled him in it, pulling him close. "I got you, little one. I got you now." Samuel's teeth chattered as he pressed against her warmth. "A home," he managed to whisper. "That's right. We're going home." Charlotte gathered him up in her arms, surprised at how light he felt. She turned back toward where she thought the wagon waited, and froze. An orange glow lit the sky to the west, where their ranch lay. Smoke rose black against the snow-filled night. "Dear God, no," she breathed. In town, Sheriff Grady burst into Asher's cell, keys jangling. "Stoltzfus, get up. Found proof of Culver's theft in the church books. You're free to go." He swung the cell door wide. "But there's more. Smoke rising from your direction. The Pike Ranch—" Asher was already moving, grabbing his coat. "Where's my horse?" "Stabled behind the jail. Go. I'll handle Culver." Asher spurred his horse through the storm, leaning low over its neck as they galloped toward the distant orange glow. His prayer rose urgent on the wind. "Lord, protect them, please." He almost rode past Charlotte in the swirling snow. She stood in a drift, Samuel clutched to her chest, staring toward the fire's glow. "Charlotte!" He reined his horse around sharply. "Asher?" Her voice broke with relief. "The barn." "Give him to me," Asher said, reaching down. "I'll ride ahead with him. Follow as quick as you can." She passed Samuel up, and Asher tucked the boy securely against his chest. "Whistle for your sisters. We'll need every hand." Charlotte's sharp whistle cut through the storm 3 times. Within minutes, June and Liddy emerged from the white darkness, and all 3 sisters hurried toward home in Asher's tracks. They found their barn engulfed in flames that hissed and crackled in the falling snow. But they weren't alone. Neighbors who'd seen the glow had already formed a bucket line from the well to the barn's side wall. "Miss Pike," old Mr. Jensen called out. "We came soon as we saw the smoke. Reckon it was deliberate. Found an oil can by the door." Charlotte set her jaw, knowing Culver's hand in this, but there was no time for anger now. She joined the line, passing buckets of water alongside faces she hadn't seen since the church trial. Even Mrs. Jensen, who'd avoided them for weeks, worked steadily beside June. Asher had taken Samuel inside the house, ensuring he was warm and safe before returning to help. He organized the men to focus their efforts on saving the main support beams, while letting the dry hay burn itself out. They worked through the night, their breath frosting in the firelight. By dawn, the flames had died to smoldering embers. The barn's walls still stood, blackened but solid. The roof would need replacing, but the foundation Asher had laid held true. As pale morning light crept across the snow, the sisters finally allowed themselves to collapse in exhaustion. Tears streaked their soot-stained faces, tears of relief, of gratitude, of overwhelming emotion for all the night had held. Asher gathered them close, his own voice rough with smoke and feeling as he prayed aloud. "Heavenly Father, we thank you for your mercy this night. You spared life over timber, brought neighbors to our aid, and returned our lost lamb to the fold. We ask your blessing on this house and all who shelter here. Amen." "Amen," chorused the tired voices of neighbors and family alike. Inside the house, Samuel slept peacefully by the hearth, the wooden horse Asher had carved clutched tight in his small hands. Outside, the storm had finally passed, leaving the world clean and white beneath the rising sun. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow as Sheriff Grady strode through Red Dog Crossing's muddy street, church ledger tucked under his arm. He found Reverend Culver counting collection money at his desk. Interesting bookkeeping you've got here, Reverend, the sheriff said, dropping the leather-bound ledger onto the desk. Seems the orphan fund's been going straight into your personal account. Culver's face drained of color. He knocked over his chair, scrambling to his feet. That's a misunderstanding. No, sir, that's theft. The sheriff's voice hardened. And I reckon attempted murder too, after that fire last night. Word spread quickly through town. By the time Culver tried sneaking out the church's back door, a crowd had gathered at the Pike Ranch, where the charred barn still smoldered in the afternoon light. Charlotte stood in the yard, her dress and face still streaked with soot from the night's battle with the flames. She watched calmly as Culver's horse thundered toward them, the Reverend's coat flapping behind him like dark wings. Sheriff Grady cut him off at the gate. That's far enough. Culver reined his horse so hard it reared. The crowd pressed closer, murmuring as understanding dawned. They'd believed his lies, shunned their neighbors, all while he'd been stealing from them. You burned our roof, Charlotte called out, her voice carrying across the yard, but not our faith. The sheriff hauled Culver down from his saddle. The Reverend's fine boots slipped in the mud as he was led away in handcuffs, his head bowed in shame. One by one, neighbors stepped forward. Old Mr. Jensen offered lumber from his mill. Mrs. Thompson promised food for the workers. Even Culver's young assistant came forward, tears in his eyes, confessing how he'd been forced to spy and spread lies. We were wrong, Mrs. Jensen said softly. About everything. Asher leaned against a scorched post, exhaustion etched on his face. Still, he pulled out his carpenter's pencil and began sketching plans for rebuilding. His hands trembled slightly from the night's ordeal, but his voice remained steady as he directed volunteers where to stack fresh lumber. That evening, Samuel slept peacefully between June and Liddy, their bed piled high with quilts. Charlotte checked on them before heading downstairs, where she found Asher still working by lamplight. Over the next 2 days, the valley rang with the sounds of reconstruction. Hammers echoed across the snow as neighbors worked side by side, raising new beams into the winter sky. The smell of June's fresh bread drifted from the kitchen, where she baked loaf after loaf for the volunteers. Liddy carefully painted the sign they'd saved from the fire. House of Sons, it read in neat letters. She worked on a bench in the pale winter sunshine, humming hymns under her breath. Laughter and conversation filled the yard, so different from the lonely silence of weeks past. Where there had been judgment, now there was joy. Where there had been suspicion, now there was support. Charlotte stood watching it all from the porch steps. She saw Asher directing the roof beam placement, his quiet strength drawing respect from men who'd once shunned him. His hands moved surely as he demonstrated proper joints and bracing. Something warm unfurled in her chest as she watched him work. The ache of isolation that had haunted her for so long felt distant now, replaced by a sense of rightness and belonging. God's plan, she realized, had been greater than she'd imagined. April brought gentle rain that washed winter's shadows from the valley. The constant patter on the roof seemed to whisper promises as green shoots pushed through melting snow. Around the Pike Ranch, new grass rippled like a verdant sea beneath clearing skies. The orphan home stood proud against the brightening horizon. Fresh-cut pine walls glowed golden in morning light, while the new bell, a gift from the sheriff, gleamed on the wraparound porch. Inside, June and Liddy had arranged neat rows of beds, each topped with colorful quilts sewn by ladies from town. The rooms smelled of lemon soap and fresh bread, ready to welcome little ones in need of shelter. They didn't wait long. Word spread through nearby settlements, and soon children began arriving. A miner's widow brought her 2 boys, unable to feed them after cave-in took their father. A week later, a trail-weary family left their youngest daughter, promising to return when fortune smiled. Each time, Charlotte opened the door wide, gathering small bodies close as Asher carried in their meager belongings. On a particularly fine Sunday morning, the whole town gathered at the creek for Samuel's baptism. Wildflowers dotted the banks where townsfolk stood shoulder to shoulder, their former prejudices washed away like winter's ice. Asher waded into the crystal water, his black trousers rolled up, white shirt gleaming in sunshine. Samuel followed, trembling but smiling, dressed in new clothes the sisters had sewn. The boy's eyes never left Asher's face as the carpenter spoke the ancient words of blessing. Charlotte, June, and Liddy stood at the water's edge, linked arm in arm. Tears streamed down their cheeks as Asher lowered Samuel beneath the surface and raised him up again, born anew in faith and family. When Samuel burst from the water, he threw his arms around Asher's neck. "Thank you, Papa," he cried out. The word echoed across the creek, and ripples of gentle laughter spread through the crowd like sunshine through leaves. That evening, long tables groaned beneath platters of food as the entire community gathered to celebrate. Children darted between adults' legs, their laughter mixing with the murmur of conversation. Even those who had once whispered accusations now passed dishes with warm smiles. As the sun painted the sky in amber and rose, Asher rose from his seat, tin cup raised high. "To sons," he called out, voice thick with emotion, "born and found." The words rang clear as a bell across the yard. "To sons," the sisters echoed, their faces shining with joyful tears. Other voices joined in, until the toast swelled like a hymn. Later, as stars began pricking through the darkening sky, Charlotte stood in the doorway, watching the last guests depart. Asher joined her, his quiet presence as steady as the ground beneath their feet. "You gave us sons, after all," she whispered, gesturing to where Samuel slept on a bench, surrounded by other children. Asher shook his head gently. "No," he replied, voice soft as a prayer. "The Lord did." Inside, lanterns cast warm pools of light across sleeping faces. Their glow spilled out into the spring night like hope made visible, hanging in the air as sweet and lingering as hymn smoke. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.